As learners, how do your teachers usually teach you? Have you been given more than one way to learn a concept? Or given chance to choose an activity you like to use to showcase your understanding? What do you think of a classroom where students' interests are given more importance and their learning preference is more integrated in the flow of the lesson? Ideal, isn't it? This sounds like an ad, but it isn't. Hello, I'm Roxanne and I'm one of the lecturers for this program. Welcome to the first part of the lecture on Universal Design for Learning, or simply called UDL. Have you heard about this approach before? Well, some of you might have, right? Anyway, we have two parts to this lecture. And in this first part, we will be concentrating on the basics of UDL. That would mean its meaning and the principles where it is based from. Also, we get to compare a UDL classroom from a traditional classroom. Then on the second part, we'll go deeper on the application of this approach. Moreover, my aim for this lecture is to help you develop understanding on UDL by gaining knowledge on its different principles. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to compare a UDL classroom with traditional teaching. For the last objective, comparing a UDL classroom and traditional teaching, I would like you to observe and mentally note any comparison you realize between the use of UDL and that of a traditional classroom. Again, as we go through our lesson, our lecture, I would like you to note some observations you have on the differences or perhaps similarities of UDL classroom and a traditional classroom. I hope that's clear. So let's learn how we can do more for our students with the use of UDL. To start, what do you think is UDL? Well, I asked you earlier, right? What do you think is universal design for learning? Well, according to a lot of definitions, okay, here is what we understood. UDL is an approach to curriculum design that can help teachers modify the teaching and learning course to serve all learners regardless of their diversity. That would mean having a plan to accommodate all differences or diversity you can see in your class. That would include their ability, okay, their cognitive ability, disability if there are, their age. Some might be older, some might be with the right age, okay, their gender, okay. There are lots of gender nowadays, and we aim to accommodate that as well in class. And of course, linguistic ability. Like if you're teaching using English, okay, you aren't sure that your students have the same ability, right? I mean, you could be sure that your students have different English ability or English skills. And UDL aims to provide you a way on which you could modify the lesson and accommodate those differences. That's why it has the word universal. Universal, as the word implies, this design for learning attempts to fit in students collectively by enabling teachers or educators to modify the curriculum or the lesson. So I guess the saying or the adage for UDL is no one left behind, right? I hope you understand what UDL means. Simply means. Well, of course, there is still a lot to UDL. And if you would want to, you could read more about UDL or research more about it. Okay, one more thing to keep in mind as we go through our lecture is that UDL aims to fix the learning environment to accommodate the learner. That's why it enables teachers to modify the curriculum. A curriculum is a part of the learning environment. So we adjust, we modify the curriculum so we can accommodate the learner. Okay, so it's not fixing the learner, it is fixing the environment, the learning environment. Moving on, let's get to know the different principles forming UDL. So we have three, namely engagement or multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. You might be wondering what these principles are, so let's go deeper into them. So the first principle is multiple means of engagement, providing your students several means for them to involve themselves in the lesson. In this principle, consider recruiting interest. How? So we have two suggestions here. One, allow learners to participate in the design of classroom activities, academic tasks, and goals. Why should we allow them, or why should we let them join when we think of our activities, when we plan for our activities, academic tasks, and goals? Well, think about it. If you include them, they will give you their own ideas, what they're interested in, and that will motivate them more to participate in your class because it's the activity they want to do, the task that they want to do, and the goals that they want to achieve. And two, create an accepting environment. Well, as we said earlier, a UDL aims to embrace all types of diversity, right? So that means your classroom or the situation in your classroom should also be accepting. So making them feel involved and heard will hopefully improve how they welcome your lessons. Next, how do we encourage their effort and persistence? First suggestion, we provide activities with different degrees of difficulty. As we mentioned earlier, our students have different abilities, different levels of abilities in one factor or one skill. So some students might want to do an easier task because it's a little difficult for them. Some would want to do an average type, and some learners might want to do something challenging because they can do it with their skills. That's why it's important to provide them different levels of difficulty. Could be an easy task, an average task, and a challenging or difficult task. You could also provide just one activity with different levels of difficulty. 2. We try to focus more on their effort in completing a task. Did you understand? Focus more on effort. Focus more on the process instead of the completion. Is it a failure or a success? Why should we do that? It's because more skills are shown in solving the problem, in the process, right? So we should appreciate how they also tried their best, how they applied their skills in completing the task, even though it might be a failure, right? That is one way of encouraging them to continue on learning. And 3, appreciating diligence is also recommended. Well, as we mentioned earlier, focus more on the effort rather than the outcome or the result. So, doing these 3 things will help in keeping our learners challenged and at the same time appreciated even if they were not able to succeed in the results. Lastly is self-regulation. So how do we support learning growth of our students? First one, support activities that encourages self-reflection and identification of personal goals. Support activities that encourage self-reflection and identification of personal goals. Okay, we should not let our students to decide on their goals. We should help them too, right? We should guide them. Also, self-reflection is important. Self-reflection is important. Why? Because it allows them to discover what they are able and what they are not able to do. Second, provide prompts and guides which accommodates both strength and weaknesses. Okay, so when we evaluate them, we should provide not only the weaknesses or the failure, but also their strengths. Okay? It's very important for them to see what skills are they good at and what skills or factors do they need to improve. So in the principle of engagement, as we can see, we should involve our students, keep them interested in varying activities, and also help them understand their own weaknesses and strengths. So that's for the first principle. The next principle is on representation. How can we present information in ways that reach all learners? How can we present information in more ways that reach all learners? First, think about perception. First recommendation is use flexible materials that can be modified based on their needs and preferences. UDL allows you that, but you should also think of your materials that could be modified, not permanent. Okay, that's why in your materials, when you make it, while making it, you should already think of the challenges that you will be having in that type of lesson. How about your students' abilities? Do you need to accommodate different skills in your material? So make it flexible and be able to be modified if you need to. Next, offer information in more ways than sound or voice alone. That means when you teach the lesson, you should do more than one type of method. Instead of just lecturing, you can have some video watching, You can have them read, you can have them research or discuss. More ways than one. Okay. Another thing to consider is language in symbol, which points to the written content of our lessons. UDL suggests that we clarify vocabulary in symbols. Another one, use translations, descriptions, and images to simplify complex vocabulary. Well, that's what we do in English, right? Have you tried teaching Korean? I think you know the struggle, right? When you learn English, you have these difficulty. Symbols. What does that symbol mean? Because you use a different symbol in your country. Also, when learning a language, you also encounter a lot of complex vocabulary. So sometimes you need to use translator, papago, description, and images to simplify those vocabulary. Lastly, on comprehension. To help them understand the content, we should, firstly, build connections to prior understanding and experiences, and accentuate information and how it relates to the goal. First, build connection to prior understanding and experiences. That's really recommended when teaching a new lesson. You should connect it to what your students might have experienced so that they will be able to picture it easier or relate to it easier. Other one, accentuate information and how it relates to the goal. Well, your lesson is guided by your goals, your objectives, right? So there should be an obvious or apparent connection between the two. Now, in summarizing this principle, we can say that knowing our students' preferences on how to learn a content and their needs to be able to understand the content, helping them with complex words, and giving them a clear picture of the content goes a long way in helping them learn a lesson with less burden. Now, on to the last principle, the principle of action and expression. How can we offer purposeful options for students to show what they know? So, after being able to learn from your representation using different methods, we should also think of how they can show us. How can we evaluate them in multiple ways to know if they understood the lesson or not? So first, we are going to solve problems using a variety of strategies or problems, activities. Okay, we are going to do activities using a variety of strategies. So like when you teach, you use different methods like lecture, video watching, discussion, debate, right? Also, in letting them show what they understood, you should also use different varieties. Not only quizzes or tests, that's very common, right? But you could also ask them to do more research, perhaps, or a project where they're going to present, perhaps, what they've learned. Another one is compose in multiple media. Right, so you can have written, you can have spoken, all right? Those are medias. And lastly, provide multiple examples. That's very important because even sometimes, even after learning a lesson, your students need more to guide them. So we need to provide examples. And one last thing to consider, post goals, objectives, and schedules in an obvious place. It's important to them to keep on looking on what they are trying to achieve, right? Because it guides their motivation as well. Another one, provide guides for breaking long-term goals into reachable short-term objectives. Okay, this is one way of guiding them into managing their own learning as well, their own personal goals. Okay. So the last principle is telling us that we should be clear with our learning goals, both short-term and long-term. Another point is to allow our learners to have multiple assessment options. In doing so, we do not restrict them, but instead give them chances to improve their creativity and self-awareness. All right, so those are the principles of UDL. Let's review them for a bit before moving on. So the first one, to be engagement with these subtopics on recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, and self-regulation. This principle, we had known the importance of properly engaging our learners for them to open up to the content and be involved from beginning to end. Then the second principle, representation with a discussion on perception, language and symbol, and comprehension. In this principle, we had talked about things we need to pay attention to when we prepare our lesson content, such as the type of material we should use, how we should use them, and on how we can make it work for all our learners. And last but not the least, action and expression with contents on expression and communication and executive function. In this principle, we were able to see how we can help our learners be able to move from the norm or the normal in internalizing the content or showing what they had learned. Not just using the common test in quizzes after a lesson, but more diverse types of tasks. All right, now that we know the basics, time to ask about the task I gave you earlier. What are the differences you have noted? Might have forgotten. I asked you earlier to note some observations you have on the differences of a UDL classroom and a traditional classroom. So what are your observations? What are the differences between the two? Good. I suppose you're answering me right now. Okay, so let's try to add more to your observations. In a traditional classroom, the first differences is that the primary focus is on teaching the subject matter that students need to learn. Again, the primary focus on a traditional classroom is on teaching the subject matter, on the what, right? So usually it's on lectures. So lessons are designed and taught with the common student in mind. That often means the teacher will present the material in one way for the entire class. A lesson in a history, for example, might involve the teacher lecturing the class about facts and dates while writing on the board. Typical, right? That's how I can remember from my elementary and early high school days. However, in a UDL class, the main focus is on finding ways to teach the material to the many types of learners. So teachers plan lessons to address a wide range of needs and strengths. There is no typical student in a UDL classroom, okay? Because if you're aware of the UDL approach, in your mind, it's always that your students are different from each other. So there are several types of diversity that you have in class. With that in mind, the teacher might include a typical lecture together with video watching, games like puzzles, and discussions, or even a presentation to present the what. Okay. Second difference is on accommodations. Do you know what accommodations are? Accommodations meaning specialized plans for special learners. So, for instance, a learner has a special need on writing the alphabet. So the student or the learner is having a difficulty writing the alphabet perfectly, but the others can. So that student will be given special materials and lessons that will help him or her with that learning challenge or difficulty. And those special materials and lessons are only available for that student. To compare that in a UDL class, the accommodations that some kids might get because of their special difficulty, okay, so their accommodations will be available to all students. No matter if they have a special need or not, no matter if they have a minor or severe problem, it does not discriminate. So the idea behind this is that all kids may benefit from multiple formats. For instance, if a lesson relies on a book, the book will be available to the entire class in multiple forms, like an audiobook, a book that you could listen to, or a book with illustrations if some students need some images to help them picture what's happening in that story or a book. You could also have Braille books. Braille books are for blind learners, but even some normal students who aren't blind can use it. It's available for them in a UDL classroom. Okay, another comparison. The teacher teaches in one way for the whole class, and all students are expected to learn in that way. So again, a typical example is on lectures. So yes, some learners prefer lectures, right? They like listening and taking notes. They can work that way. But others would want to, say, for example, read on their own or do some research. So the information will come from books, and they could read it and then internalize it, right? So in a UDL class, teachers and students work together to set individual learning goals. Each student gets to make choices about how to accomplish their personal goals or how to accomplish a task. So we can see that the teacher isn't the one who's deciding about all the tasks. Well, we mentioned it earlier in the first principle of UDL, right? Involve your students. So the aim is to have the student understand how she learns and become a skilled learner. A skilled learner or an expert learner knows about his or her skills and weaknesses. So through your guidance and deciding about the task, how they want to do an activity or what they want to do after a lesson will help them know more about their skills. The fourth difference, in a traditional classroom, there is only one setting, right? It's usually the teacher in front and then the students sitting in rows in front. However, in a UDL setup, the room is laid out with different spaces for different kinds of work. So you can have different stations for different activities, like a table here with a group of students doing another activity related to your main lesson, another station or another table with other students doing another activity but related to the same lesson. You can also have quiet individual work instead of groups. So separate setup for each learner. You can also have small and large group, like the group instruction for everybody. So in a UDL classroom, teaching is flexible, but it depends on the lesson and student needs. Do you think they need to have both individual and group activities? Then you should do that. And also, the teacher needs to move around to help the students as they work. Okay, the fifth comparison. In a traditional class, there is usually only one way for a student to show what he knows. That is on the principle of action and expression. So, for instance, having a quiz in the end of a lesson. That's very typical, right? However, there are many options for students to show what they know in a UDL classroom. Because students have different strengths and weaknesses in how they express themselves, these are given attention and thus they are provided methods in connection to their interest. That means several tasks are provided for the learners to choose from. For example, students can choose the format for their book report, such as could it be a video or a presentation or an essay. Okay, we still have the last one. Students get periodic feedback on their grades. However, in a traditional classroom, even if the teacher gives their grades, their feedback, so they'll say, oh, you're failing. Perhaps you could do more to get a better grade. Okay, so in a traditional class, even if they are told those grades are only to measure the cognitive aptitude, right? How smart somebody is about a subject or how not smart that student is. And they aren't used further in discussing about the student's learning weaknesses and goals, more often than not. Okay. On the other side, in a UDL setup, students get continuous feedback on how they're doing and on how they can improve on some skills by using their grades on certain areas. Okay, so feedback, which tells them how they're doing and on how they can improve on some weaknesses they have. Also, they're encouraged to reflect on their learning and whether they met lesson goals. That's very important, self-reflection. All right? So, did we cover all of your observations? Or were you able to discover more differences? Right, so to summarize what UDL classroom is, it is where teaching focuses on both what is taught and how it is taught. Again, what is taught and how it is taught. Next, accommodations are for all students. Accommodations are not only for special learners or those who have severe difficulty on a skill or activity. It is available for every student to use. Next, the teacher works with the students to decide how the student will learn the material. The teacher works with the students to decide how the student will learn the material. So your students could say, or learners could say, well, teacher, we don't want a lecture. Could we do our research instead, or could we read on our own and then have a presentation? And the teacher listens. Okay. Another one, the classroom has a flexible setup. The classroom has a flexible setup. Okay, so it's not only the students sitting in rows and the teacher in front. So they could sit on their own, they could sit with a pair or with a group, and the teacher can move around or should move around to guide them. Next, there are multiple ways to complete an assignment or a task. Lastly, grades are used to reinforce goals. It's not only to measure how smart a student is, or as I said, how not smart a student is. It is being used for a feedback and to know what the student should improve, okay, and also on self-reflection. Okay, that's it so far for the first part. Now let's summarize what we had in this part of our lecture on UDL. So we talked about UDL, what UDL is. We explored the principles, the 3 principles. I hope you remember. First one is, what's principle number 1? Multiple means of engagement. Second principle, multiple means of representation. The third principle is multiple means of action and expression. All right. Furthermore, we compared a traditional classroom to the UDL classroom. Well, that's it for now, and I hope you were able to understand the foundation of this approach. I'll see you in part 2.